Thanks for being here tonight. So I'm quite honored, I'm quite moved to be opening the new seminar at IFM, Dress Code. So as Benjamin just mentioned, this talk is going to be an opportunity to look back at some aspects of my doctoral dissertation, and more specifically, the different methodologies that I considered during my research. It's a project that I'm continuing today. When you finish with your PhD, you're never really finished, because I'm in the middle, as Benjamin mentioned, of publishing it with the Paris-based editor B42. But it's also a project that in many ways began at IFM a long, long time ago when IFM was not even here in this location. So this is why I find it even more meaningful to be presenting here today. So since the idea of this seminar is to reflect on, I quote, innovative approaches and methodologies, I thought I would share the rather iterative process that led me to forge mine. I will begin this presentation with a brief introduction, a type of ego history, or ego histoire, like we say here in France. So it's not so much to highlight my personal trajectory, to tell you all about my personal life, but more precisely to share the origin of what would become my PhD, something which is rooted not exactly in a linear academic curriculum pertaining to history or art history, but in the actual practice of fashion design. I will then identify the various methodological issues which have influenced my work during my PhD, the tools, the theories I combine to question what I've called a, quote, historiography of fashion discourses in France. I'll get back to that. Lastly, with the time I will have left, and if Benjamin doesn't tell me to stop before, I will consider a few examples, a few case studies, which I hope will exemplify my approach and hopefully some of my hypotheses. So I began my higher education in Paris studying in two fashion schools, Duperré, that some of you may know, and I continued in what was then the postgraduate program degree at IFM. So my first experience of fashion in academia was through the design process. I was taught pattern making, sewing, here at IFM working with a shoemaker, a knitter, a pattern designer, and I was also taught eventually how to translate creative inspirations into tangible objects. One of the things that first struck me during these years was that, at least at the time in fashion schools, the curriculum tailored for future fashion designers placed very little attention on history and theory. Almost none, actually. And to me, this felt very different when considering the classes that seemed to be held in architecture and design programs. I had friends following these courses, and I was quite jealous. This realization was only reaffirmed when I would enter bookstores and libraries. Designers and architects were faced with a variety of books and essays which had nothing to envy to the art theory sections, while the ones dedicated to fashion seemed to gather nothing more than monographic publications dedicated to the grand couturier and a quite canonical narrative. So this first conclusion puzzled me. When reading William Morris or Walter Gropius, to name two of the most influential design theorists who were also practitioners, the act of thinking and writing and the act of doing seem to have found a decisive connection. While again looking at the great heroes of the 19th and 20th century fashion, one seems to find only beautiful, we call them coffee table books, to illustrate this history. So here, it was not the case, of course, but this was what I was faced with and what I first thought I discovered. So here lies perhaps the fundamental impulse of my research. Where can one find fashion discourse? My first attempt at gathering a corpus, which was quite intuitive, I thought that couturiers, designers themselves, were in the best position to voice their creative intentions and to situate their work within the aesthetic but also social and political issues of their time. I find here a first body of work, but even more so, a specific literary genre, which is situated at the intersection of advertising, of commercial discourses, and of the need of justification, which defines autobiographical narratives. Basically, when you write your autobiography, you justify everything you've done in your life. I start working on a first article, which would then be published in Mode de Recherche, the former research journal at IFM, where I sought to analyze the conferences given by Pierre Balmain in Brussels in 1950 on the ties between couture and architecture, and by Christian Dior at La Sorbonne in 1955, where similar connections were made. So I begin my PhD a couple years later within an art history department at the Université Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, because for me, coming from the creative side of fashion, it was only natural to treat fashion as a creative practice with supposedly a history that would potentially align or at least find relevant points of comparison with art. But here lies perhaps the first restrictive and deceitful approach. With all due respect to the legacy of Balmain or Dior and their seductive metaphors of the couturier as architect, looking at the art of fashion through the prism of this equivalence appears quite limited, if not superficial. I have to reference an essay which I know has had a thought-provoking effect on many of us, the work of Stanford professor Nancy Troy, Couture Culture, a Study of Modern Art and Fashion, which I force most of my students to read. Troy's demonstration that a dress does not become art only through the formal proximities with an actual legitimate artwork, but rather by considering the logics and tensions between originality, production, and reproduction, left a lasting impression on me and on the way to approach fashion beyond its purely visual manifestation. So among other things, Troy says that it's not because a dress has a famous painting on it or a jacket is a reproduction of a famous painting that we can simply establish it as an art form. So of course, a lot of the work of Yves Saint Laurent in the 1980s is an illustration of this, and it has to be addressed and explored with a specific perspective. But what she's telling us is it's not that simple. It's not because it looks like art that it is art. There's other reasons to consider fashion as an art form. So going back to the idea of identifying a more deep and complex tradition of fashion discourse, I felt the need to expand my corpus well beyond the enunciators, which I had found the most obviously concerned with the topic of fashion. So I moved away from the couturier and the designers, and I thought, who can I read? Where can I read? At that point in my research, I made a rather fortuitous discovery, which I have, for various reasons, come to realize forms on different levels the true origin of my PhD. In 2001, see, as I told you, IFM is very present from the beginning of my PhD. IFM had published a book entitled Dress in the Work of Balzac, excerpts from the Comédie Humaine. I did mention, however, that my approach was art historical, so my idea wasn't to embark on a more literary exploration of the role of garments and fashion in literature. But a short note placed as a foreword to the book triggered my curiosity. I left the French version. My rough translation would be, this book faithfully reproduces the Boucher file, a broad documentary database, the result of a patient and meticulous labor of François Boucher and his wife. So the Boucher file, the fichier Boucher, still exists today. It's, physically speaking, a chest of drawers composed of dozens of sections, each filled with hundreds of handwritten notes on cards, the kind of treasures that you find in libraries in the pre-digital age, when cataloging was entirely labor of love done by hand. So François Boucher and his wife Madeleine was a bit of a I mean, it speaks as well of many issues in art history. We tend to focus when couples are doing the work on the man. But in fact, Madeleine Boucher was quite instrumental. In fact, she's the one who literally produced all of these cards. So François and Madeleine Boucher, I would soon discover, played a crucial role in the development of fashion history in France. François Boucher was a former curator of the Musée Carnavalet, the first museum in Paris to install a permanent display of historical costume after Maurice Leloir, founder of the Société d'Histoire du Costume, had donated his personal collection to the city of Paris. Boucher would dedicate his time upon his retirement to establish a scientific basis for the study of costume history in France. From 1948, he is the General Secretary of the Union Française des Arts du Costume, or UFAC. But what Paris and France needed in the middle of the 20th century wasn't another society of well-read collectors and painters infatuated with historical dress. It was a proper scholarly framework for the writing of the history of costume. A History of Costume in the West is exactly the title of the book that he would eventually publish in the mid-60s, based on what he posited to be an entirely new approach to sources. And this is what I found interesting. François Boucher was educated at the École des Chartes, France's elite school for paleography, and after a career as a curator, active in the emerging field of museography, Boucher was indeed considering costume and contemporary fashion with a very distinctive perspective. Objects, images, and texts were, in fact, interconnected. The chest of drawers I'm showing you here, the Fichier Boucher, was his and his wife's attempt at capturing the vocabulary of fashion across the last centuries. What struck me at first, as I flickered through the cards, was the variety of types and levels of discourses. Different literary genres with a radically different implication. Here are a few examples. I left them again in French, but I trust most of you can understand. So we have here different entries. The first is to illustrate the idea, the word accessories. We have an excerpt from Adam that speaks of the accessories of an elegant man. Then we have accroche-cœur, which is a way to style your hair. Then you have amphore, which, as it says here, is a term that Christian Dior used to qualify some of his silhouettes from 1958. It's also the shape of a vase. And finally, atour, which means toilette, or basically dress in a very old-fashioned way. So we have here 4 different words and 4 different contexts. Adam is a periodical dedicated to men's fashion, which is published from 1925 to 1973. The Journal des Demoiselles was launched in 1833 and is published throughout the 19th century with the ambition of educating well-to-do young ladies from the bourgeoisie. L'Art et la Mode, which is first published in the 1880s, accompanies the rise of haute couture, establishing, as its title suggests, fashion as a form of art. Lastly, the Memoirs of Saint-Simon. It's hard to switch from French to English, so the Memoirs of Saint-Simon, a masterpiece of French literature, are also an insightful comment on late 17th and early 18th century society. So with their dictionary, François and Madeleine Boucher had the ambition of better understanding certain pieces of clothes and accessories, the way they were worn, their function in a silhouette. Gathering these written discourses served the project of the Union Française des Arts du Costume, forming a collection of objects and materials for a future museum of fashion to be opened in the city of Paris. So this is actually a very long process because Paris didn't have a fashion museum for a very long time. It had a series of temporary exhibitions during the second half of the 19th century, often connected with the what is now today the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, which was back then the Union Centrale des Arts Décoratifs. There were a few fashion exhibitions during the World Fair, mainly during the World Fair of 1900. And Carnavalet, I just mentioned, was really the first museum to have a permanent costume gallery, but it was just a couple rooms from 1924. So this struggle to have an actual museum of fashion in Paris was really the battle of François Boucher and of many others. And it will eventually happen in the mid-50s, from 1954, the Museum of Modern Art in Paris, which the collection would then later move across the street and become the Palais Galliera as we know it. So this was just a little side note, but for you to understand this obsession in the middle of the 20th century of all these collectors and scholars, they really wanted to establish a museum and the scholarly knowledge that went with costume and fashion history. So to go back again to the work of the Boucher couple, what I found interesting was not so much the connection between text and image or text and material object. It was more the idea of following through time and through various types of discourses a certain description, a certain definition of what fashion is. So there's another reading, which I'm going to combine with this first one, which had a strong impact on the construction of my methodology for my PhD. So I'm not a philosopher and I have no claims to becoming one. But nonetheless, it was two essays by Michel Foucault that provided a rather thought-provoking reflection for me. So the first essay is The Order of Things, Les mots et les choses, published in 1966, and then later his Archaeology of Knowledge in 1969. So I quote the first paragraph of Foucault's Archaeology of Knowledge. For many years now, historians have preferred to turn their attention to long periods, as if beneath the shifts and changes of political events, they were trying to reveal the stable, almost indestructible system of checks and balances, the irreversible process, the constant readjustments, the underlying tendencies that gather force and are then suddenly reversed after centuries of continuity, the movements of accumulation and slow saturation, the great silent, motionless bases that traditional history has covered with a thick layer of event, unquote. So this is the very first paragraph of Foucault's essay, and it actually identifies a notion that the French historian Fernand Braudel has coined, the notion of longue durée, or long term in English, which allows us to look away from the notion of event, événement, a more superficial action whose reach does not necessarily impact a more profound and significant movement of history. It is the idea of episteme, which Foucault puts forward here, that I was drawn to. Again, I insist, not as a philosopher, but as an art historian, reading Foucault and seeing almost images of how you can write history, and preparing the debate for later for people who have issues with Foucault. So I was drawn nonetheless to this idea, the concept of episteme, one that states that a certain period of time can be defined by the formation of a set of specific knowledge, that a moment, an era, can be delimited by a certain state of knowledge. These, quote, discursive formations suggest to take into consideration, instead of the individual actions of man, different chronological sequences as seen through the prism of intellectual history. This is how one can understand how certain notions are shaped. Quote, what is then medicine, grammar, political economy, asks Foucault. In French, qu'est-ce donc que la médecine, la grammaire, l'économie politique? I continue the quote. We asked on what kind of unity they could be based. Were they simply a reconstruction after the event, based on particular works, Successive theories, notions, and themes, some of which had been abandoned, others maintained by tradition, and again, others fated to fall into oblivion, only to be revived at a later date. Were they simply a series of linked enterprises? Unquote. What Foucault conceives is that an object formed by discourses can also be transformed through them, and that the different fields of knowledge that this same object can go through time, can't guarantee its stability. Quite the opposite. Objects are perpetually recomposed by the discourses that form them. So Foucault famously takes the example of madness to show how this idea, the notion of madness, is not the same one discussed by medical studies of the 17th or 18th centuries or by legal sentences or police reports in the later centuries. So here we have the case of different discourses giving different definitions of one same idea. So this is where I borrow my first hypothesis, working hypothesis, from Foucault. An idea evolves through time by traveling through different epistemological fields that contribute to redefining its very essence, its very definition. If I go back to the Boucher folder, the fichier Boucher, one can indeed postulate that the idea of fashion discussed by the different authors is in fact fundamentally different as well. The discourses that forged the idea of fashion in the 18th century or the 1960s belong to different established sets of knowledge pertaining to these specific scientific, cultural, and political contexts. In this way, they naturally inform different definitions of fashion. By collecting a variety of discourses and by paying close attention to their respective enunciators, and this on the longue durée, over the course of decades, centuries even, we can see shifts and paradigms appear. Who talks about fashion? At what time? And from which point of view? And how do these discourses shape the very idea of fashion? So these were my first methodological findings, or at least questions more than findings, right? I had confirmed my intuition. One can discuss fashion, study its history, not exclusively through an attention to the variation of its shapes and silhouettes. For example, instead of looking at the transition from the crinoline to the S-shaped line, or another example, a very obvious transition in fashion history. When you study fashion history, for example, menswear, you immediately think that fashion history is here to explain the transition, say, from an opulently embroidered men's jacket from the Ancien Régime, from court society, to understanding why ultimately the bourgeois style was darker and much simpler. So instead of looking at these images and the way that these objects evolved, I thought, well, I can understand the evolution of fashion by considering the discourses that define them. And I have to say here, it was almost a bit of a reaction because I had been so surrounded by images of fashion and objects of fashion by my training and by my first work experiences. I think this working hypothesis was a bit extreme precisely because I wanted to only look at fashion through words, only look at fashion through discourses. So my idea was to displace, to follow the idea of fashion on the long term, on the longue durée. And to do so, I would focus my work on the 19th century, or should I say the very long 19th century in France. A century that really starts in the post-revolutionary context, so in the 1790s, around 1800, and that finishes with the Two World War in the following one. So from a bit of French history here, from the First Empire, 1804-1814, in the context of the July monarchy, 1830-1848, to, on the other end, the interwar era of the 20th century, so 1918-1939. So as you see, it really stretched. It was truly a longue durée. So this long term allowed me to go through different political contexts, and this is what I found interesting, right? Because it was so broad. I went through monarchy, republics, empires, I went through very different economical contexts, going through moments of industrial and financial boom, but also financial recessions, and also, of course, very different social contexts, the cohesion of the people in the revolutionary context, to the rise of forms of capitalist individualism. So lots of different contexts. It also allowed me to let go of the contingency pertaining to each of these events and to embrace a broader, perhaps more profound evolution of the idea of fashion. But as the title of this talk suggests, and as I have previously mentioned, this research is first and foremost conducted within the field of art history. I mentioned that my PhD was in an art history department. In this way, it entails a certain trajectory. And this was my subtitle, La mode à l'épreuve de l'art, my title actually. La mode à l'épreuve de l'art, so this idea of fashion facing or measuring up to art. It suggests, if not a conclusion, at least a form of comparison or confrontation. In other words, it steers towards what we can call a state or a process of becoming art. So in French, we would say un processus de devenir art. When considering discourses on fashion, and more specifically when paying attention to its changing enunciators, the cuts and sequences that the writing of its history suggests appear renewed. So basically my first realization is when you look at fashion through discourses, fashion history is not structured and written in the same way. The framework I'm considering, so roughly 1800, 1930, is one formed by the French post-revolutionary and industrial society. It's one that rises in the early decades of the 19th century, and which arguably loses its influence in the new geopolitical order of the mid-20th century. So basically, it speaks of the position in France after World War II. At least in art history, it's not so much the center of the world anymore. So during this long century, France is in a dominant, if not imperialist position, at the center of a cultural and political context that places the country as an heir to the legacy of the Enlightenment. Fashion is precisely mirroring these ambitions and ideals and these transformations. With this historiographical perspective, I sought to understand how the actors of such transformation could inspire new turns and divisions in the historical narrative of fashion. I identified three successive categories of enunciators through the constitution of my corpus of discourse. So I'm getting to the last part. And I'm going to share these three in a very succinct way, the three different types of enunciators that have shaped this writing of the history of fashion in 19th century France. So my hypothesis was that we could find a first moment with one specific enunciator, which I would call the littérateurs, or littérateurs in French. That would be around 1830. I found other enunciators, the inventors, towards the middle of the century, and finally, creators at the turn of the century. So these three, littérateurs, inventors, and creators. So with the time I have left, I'll share some of the most significant aspect of each of these categories. Of course, it'll be a bit superficial, but it'll give you an idea of how I constructed my approach. So the first, the littérateurs, and its French counterpart, as I said, the littérateur. What is a littérateur? A littérateur is a person who makes a living out of writing. So we're in the context of the early 19th century when you can actually make good money by publishing articles. I recently saw the film Les Illusions Perdues. Maybe some of you have seen it. It came out, I think, a couple months ago. And I was very moved because I was like, this is my PhD. I understood. It was in image what I was talking about. So if you want to understand this very exciting moment in the 1830s where young journalists would come to Paris and believe and actually succeeded in making a fortune out of publishing and writing, watch this film. So this moment can almost entirely be read and understood through the life and work of Honoré de Balzac, which you have here photographed by Louis-Auguste Bisson. Indeed, from his early works in the 1820s, late 1820s, then an aspiring author and a very prolific journalist, to his contribution for the great editor Émile de Girardin's newspaper La Mode, Balzac has placed fashion at the center of his literature. But here is most certainly his most decisive contribution. Fashion for Balzac does not only include dress, but a whole set of behaviors, such as language, vocabulary, attitudes, which the London dandies and Paris dandies are so eloquently able to master. This was precisely what interested me. Through the words of Balzac, we acknowledge fashion as a rather abstract idea, a relatively intangible principle. It becomes a set of rules to decipher the social landscape, the crowd surrounding a flaneur on the great boulevards of the French capital. The way this understanding, this definition of fashion penetrates the greatest literature, as well as the most superficial, if not cheap, columns in poorly printed newspaper is striking. So here's a quote from Balzac that I often like to share. I'll let you read it in French. My approximative English translation is, "Today these nuances have acquired a real importance, for now that our morals tend to level everything, now that the 12-franc clerk can prevail over a marquis by grace and manners, by elegance of costume, and can sometimes crush him by the power of his speech, nuances alone allow people to recognize themselves in the midst of the crowd." So this was an article published by Balzac in La Mode, this very rather successful newspaper. So soon the variety of texts that later on Walter Benjamin will define as a panoramic literature. So I'm thinking here of other types of literature such as physiologies, bear witness to this obsession for describing, classifying, with the goal of establishing types to better organize, to better read the society, that the succession of political regimes has literally disorganized or rendered utmost confusing. So we're in a context where political regime after another, from empire to restoration to republic, there's a real confusion. And Balzac in his theory of fashion helps people see the difference between the different citizens. And he says by looking at the way they behave, by looking at this, by understanding this idea of fashion, the way it's performed and embodied, this is how you can understand society. So fashion at the time is very intangible. It becomes a structuring principle for society. But these words, these descriptions, they produce above all images. So that's a bit of a paradox. So even by looking only at fashion discourses, I somehow came across a very prolific visual culture. I wanted to ignore images, but they were there through the words. So these images, they're situated at the intersection of science and entertainment. So let me explain what I mean by then. Science, because these images, the descriptions of these looks, of these behaviors, of these outfits, they borrow from natural sciences. In the early 19th century, we have naturalists and scientists such as Buffon or Cuvier that are theorizing the principles of description and classification of species. So it borrows a lot from their word and their discourses. But it's also, as I said, at the intersection between science and entertainment. And entertainment, because this parade of types of character that we can now witness in the pages of Balzac and in the streets of Paris alike, put on a real performance. It's a play of appearances, of disappearances, in these newly found social scenes that have just recently become public. So what's also very exciting about this moment is that we have stages everywhere. We have stages outside, we have stages inside with the development of very early cinema. So outdoor terraces, wide sidewalks on the main boulevards, They participate in the paradigm shift in vision that Jonathan Crary describes particularly well in Techniques of the Observer. So on vision and modernity in the 19th century. From the diorama, which were some of these early forms of not so much moving images, but they were the inventions announcing cinema, to photography, which was announced as an invention in 1839. In this context, fashion become a moving but resolutely ephemeral image. So this was my first category, this first moment, let's say the first 3 decades of the 19th century. The second type of enunciator, one that allowed me to shape this sort of central chapter of my research and which caught my attention, I said, is the inventor. After having been a narrative, an act of literature, if I may say, I became interested in how fashion became embodied, materialized, or commodified. So the shift I found interesting was around the 1830s, 1840s. I realized that in discourses, fashion went from being an abstract idea to becoming a commodity. So from being a theory to becoming an object. So industrial literature has been a central source here. So what do I mean by industrial literature? So technical manuals, especially books published to explain to tailors and seamstresses how to practice their trade, but also patents, so a bit of a legal literature, and reports from juries of the now recurrent world fairs. So it's that type. It's not as poetic as the first types of text that I was dealing with. It's much more technical and sometimes a bit boring, but in fact quite fascinating. So fashion, in other words, is now manufactured. It is quantified in number of working hours, in production speed, and of course in financial costs. So I would like to share here a book, which is one of my favorites. It's not so well known, but I found it extremely insightful. I'm sure some of you know it. So it's the work of Honoré de Balzac, called La mode et ses métiers, frivolité and lutte des classes. She herself looks at this type of literature I've just mentioned, and she gathers, especially from newspapers, issues, these new issues that you touch upon when you talk about fashion in the 1840s, 1850s. So we talk about the rise of working classes. We talk about its early fights and struggles. We talk about the foundation of new political ideologies through events such as the strike of the canuts in Lyon, so the silk workers in Lyon. So talking about fashion now means talking about labor, really. Soon, the experiments of Louis Blanc and his national workshops, which employed out-of-work tailors at the beginning of the Second Republic. So really a workers' literature, une littérature ouvrière, made of leaflets and manifestos, which forms a precious and crucial source to understand fashion. As the scholar José Luis Diaz puts it, this specific period, which corresponds to the rise and multiplication of technical innovations stemming from the Industrial Revolution, this period corresponds to a special moment when, I quote, things exceed words. I find this very striking. So I quote José Luis Diaz. He says, this influx of objects in mass pre-standardized forms was accompanied by a profound change of balance between words and things. So I feel it's a very striking image to picture. Women and men so overwhelmed by the multiplication of commodities that they struggle to develop the right vocabulary. So you have to picture these machines sort of creating these objects almost to the minute. And you imagine these men and women just surrounded by objects and not even knowing how to name them anymore. So we make more objects than we have words to describe them. This is very eloquently observed in the reports that attempt to qualify the different types of fabrics, accessories, but also the new tools that have manufactured them. And this is where I spent hours reading the reports that, again, sound a little bit boring, but in the world fairs, they have catalogs listing all the objects. And you have under the category cotton or the category wool about hundreds of different definition or description. And it's this attempt, which I found so moving, of, again, these women and men, mostly men, surrounded by materials and having to come up with words to describe them. But it's also here, so this is exactly what I was talking about. It's much better to see what I'm talking about. So it's one out of dozens of these, or hundreds of these reports. So I let you appreciate how, wool, silk, cotton can become dozens of subcategories and subcategories. I had a lot of fun reading this. But it's also here that another work, another reading helps me in, again, my methodology. It's a work that is often quoted, actually, in fashion studies and in fashion research. It's the work of Igor Kopitov in the book that was directed by Arjun Appadurai, The Social Life of Things, Commodities and Cultural Perspective, published in 1986. And it's his theory, it's Kopitov's theory of the biography of the object that interests me. By tracing the way in which, in my case, for fashion history, a corset, for example, appears first as a technical object and then as a fashion object, I tried to understand this transition, what Kopitov calls this process of commodification, which relies on a commodification of artifacts. So this idea that not all artifacts are born as commodities. It would be another thing to explain, but just perhaps one quote to help you picture what I'm talking about. In the fashion press of the 1840s, I was always very interested in how there's often articles describing dinners or balls, social events, and where the attention of the journalist is placed solely on the objects, on the accessories, almost forgetting the fact that they're embodied. So here's from the Petit Courrier des Dames, 1837, quote, "One could have recognized with the white satin boots buttoned with pearls, the name of Monsieur Co, Boulevard des Italiens, number 11, just as well as with the flexibility, the elegance, and precision of the waist. One did not hesitate to guess that the corsets Josselin, Rue de la Paix 13 and Rue du Ponceau 2, had lent their art to our most graceful crinolines." So here you have like an assembly of people, but the people are no longer there. It's literally a corset, a shoe, and boots. So I'm going to finish, so we have time as well for question, with the last part, which is a part that corresponds to another strange word coined by this time a sociologist. I'm quoting here Nathalie Einisch. She has theorized this idea of a process of artification or becoming art. I could speak about it for a long time because this is definitely the most important part of my research in terms of pages and time spent, but I will limit myself here to a brief demonstration of the interest I have found in approaching this question through discourses on fashion, through what is said about fashion rather than through the objects themselves. So again, as I said in the introduction, when you think, oh, art and fashion, you think of a very beautiful, opulent dress and you think this is an artwork. But how do you understand this idea of fashion becoming art when you look at words and texts and discourses? So you're probably, this is not a breaking news, you're probably all very aware of this, but in the middle of the 19th century, we see a major turning point in the history of fashion. Historians have placed 1858 as the birth and the invention of haute couture in Paris by an English entrepreneur named Charles Frederick Worth. Nothing new here. But much has been said about this man who had the ability to reinvent a commercial system by positioning the designer no longer as a supplier at the service of his customers, but as a visionary artist, even a tyrant of fashion, able to impose his taste and thus his dresses. So this turn is not insignificant. It reflects a profound change, a redefinition of the actors who make fashion. So what appealed to me was the emergence of this new figure, of this new role in the contemporary fashion discourse. And I have to say there was a first observation that was quite puzzling. The mention of the word couturier, so of its role, and the notion of haute couture arrives really later, 2 or 3 decades after its so-called invention. So more specifically around the turn of the century. This is when we can read in magazines about the role and the trade of the grand couturier, but before that, not so much. And on the other hand, when I considered discourse on art, especially the work of certain art critics, in the middle of the 19th century, I came across some thought-provoking, rather intriguing connections. A very eloquent, if not canonical example. In 1858, while couture was being invented in Worth's salon in the Rue de la Paix, Théophile Gautier published an article in the magazine L'Artiste, which is also very important in art history, in art historiography, because it was a publication that was also giving art and art criticism a history of its own. So Gautier was the editor-in-chief at the time when he published De la Mode. So you have to think of a man who's truly an art critic, truly an artist, a poet that has obviously nothing to do initially with fashion. So he publishes this very long article called De la Mode. It's quite long because it's several pages, and it challenges contemporary painters. It tells painters that they should look at the beauty of contemporary clothes and stop being so obsessed with the true beauty of of the antiquity, especially nude. So Gautier's interest in clothing, which had become quite evident in his appearance in 1830 at the premiere of Hernani. So that's the premiere of this play by Victor Hugo, and Gautier shows up wearing a bright red vest with long hair. He's sort of a hero of the Romantics. So we had this assumption that he was interested in fashion, but still. It was here the coincidence between Gautier's publication in 1858 in an art magazine of comments on fashion and the invention of haute couture. This sort of triggered my interest, and it suggested me to pursue in this track to look at the presence and comments of clothing in art criticisms. And in fact, when I started doing that, examples abounded. Another one then. In 1851, in his famous letter to Madame Sand, which also appeared in L'Artiste, and which accompanied the reception of Courbet's L'Enterrement à Ornans, which you see here. It was exhibited at the Pavillon du Réalisme on the fringes of the World's Fair. So it's the moment when he's very upset and he sort of launches his own movement. It's a strategy, really. So this is Courbet showing his huge painting, L'Enterrement à Ornans. So there is another art critic, quite influential, Champfleury, who writes in L'Artiste this article that he dedicates to Madame Sand. And he also dwells on contemporary clothing. He underlines the surprise of the public to see, I quote, treated with the same development that L'Argilière had given to the description of magistrat going to the Mass of the Holy Spirit, the clothes of farmer. So what is Champfleury saying here? He says the public was shocked that a painter like Courbet would give as much attention, as much technical attention to the clothing of basically these guys here, the peasants, the farmers. So not exactly the beautiful silk brocart embroidered dresses that painters had been used to depicting with a lot of fun throughout art history. What was interesting here was that it became an actual subject. And so what Champfleury says, I quote, "What artists call costumes, that is to say, 1,001 symbols, feathers, flies, aigrettes, etc., may amuse frivolous minds for a moment, but the serious representation of the actual personality, the round hats, the black clothes, the varnished shoes, or the peasant's clogs, this is all more interesting." So maybe one last example, which is so central, and I'll finish, it'll really be my conclusion. Charles Baudelaire. Charles Baudelaire is most certainly the third major figure in art criticism to have taken an interest in contemporary fashion. One can realize this from his first salon, so his first publications that are actually considered as art criticism. In the series of texts, as he's actually already attempting to forge his theory of beauty, he gathers his evocations of the bizarre. The beautiful is always bizarre, tells Baudelaire. His fascination for the notion of novelty, of newness, that he really connects with the criteria of taste that fashion embodies and formulates. But it's certainly through his painter of modern life that you see, that you don't see here. This is another one, L'héroïsme de la vie moderne. So it's certainly with his painter of modern life, published in various issues of the Figaro in 1863, that the idea becomes clearer. I quote, "The idea that man makes himself of beauty is printed all over his adjustments, crumples and stiffens his dress, rounds or aligns his gestures, or even subtly penetrates the long run, the feature of his face. Man ends up looking like what he would like to be." So what do I want to say here, really, and this, again, will be my conclusion, is that the attention that these three critics have paid to contemporary clothing during the 1850s and 1860s have, in my opinion, been crucial in preparing an aesthetic and artistic reception of dress. So in other words, the discourse has prepared the reception of objects and images. So that before acknowledging the grandiose beauty of haute couture, dresses that will embody the spirit of Paris's Belle Époque, the very tangible reality of craft of fashion, attaining an exquisite level of sophistication, convincing all observers of its art-like quality, I believe that discourses on fashion that permeates various types of literature, that's another one, pertaining to art, so poetry, art criticism, this has all played a central role, as I said, in preparing the last paradigm shift, this transition from commodity to art. So I'll finish here. I hope I was not too long and clear, but I'm here for questions. So.